Welcome to The Guardian, a law enforcement podcast aimed to educate citizens about law enforcement practices. I'm your co-host, Felicia Morris.
The Guardian is a podcast dedicated to talking about serious issues that are impacting us at a national level. Operation Cross Country is a law enforcement operation that is conducted annually between federal law enforcement, namely the FBI, and local law enforcement. Its purpose is to track down human trafficking victims. This year's Operation Cross Country resulted in 200 victims, including more than 50 underage victims and another 50 children that had been reported missing being discovered, and over 6 human traffickers successfully apprehended. The movie Sound of Freedom has dramatically increased the issues of human trafficking awareness. You do not have to travel to a foreign country to see it. It is in every state, and it is a regional and local fight. Today's guest is a leader in both combating domestic violence and human trafficking.
With that, our guest today is Sandy Middleton. Sandy is the executive director of the Center for Violence Prevention. She has an extensive resume of experience as a devoted advocate for victims of domestic violence and human trafficking, and has worked incredibly hard to assist in passing legislation to improve victim safety. Some of her past experience includes a legislative director and a board member for the Mississippi Coalition Against Domestic Violence, a board member for Mississippians Against Human Trafficking, as well as a chair of the Victim Services Committee on Governor Bryant's Human Trafficking Task Force. So welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Sandy, we're very excited to have you here. And my first question right out the gate, when I was reading over doing the research, we believe everyone has the right to a life free of violence. And that brings me to, you're an English undergrad. You're a public policy graduate from Mississippi State University.
Yes, sir.
And how did that story end up being on the front lines of combating domestic violence and human trafficking?
Well, that's a great question. And, there's another tie to Mississippi State. I was actually just finishing up with working with Amy Tuck in her second race for lieutenant governor. And, she's just been a great friend and through the years. And so we got through with her successful campaign. And I was sitting around just trying to decide what am I going to do next, and read an article about where I work now was having real difficulty with funding and closure. And so I just reached out to a lot of friends that we had, worked together on the campaign, and we came together and raised some money to keep the place open. And, it just sometimes things happen in your life, and you turn around and you find yourself where you were supposed to be all along.
Right.
And, for me, it was a spiritual thing. It was a God thing. And he put me there, and I kept trying to leave. And because I was thinking, well, no, this is really what I want to do over here. And the doors just kept closing. And finally, I just submitted. And that was, I guess, almost 20 years ago now. So been there a long time.
No doubt. Well, I'm speaking on behalf of law enforcement throughout Mississippi. I'm glad that those doors that kept returning you back were there. We needed that education that you got in public policy development to help put some structure and some organization in a critical link in what your organization does for law enforcement. And that's what this podcast is about, to talk about. There's obviously your Center for Violence Prevention addressed two major issues: domestic violence and human trafficking.
Right.
Each of those could be a podcast in and of itself. I think for today, we go human traffic heavy.
Okay.
So let's talk about that. Tell me about your organization. Tell me about your mission. And I know a little bit about it, but tell our viewers about it.
Yeah, so we started several years ago, probably now about a dozen or 15 years ago. We started seeing cases that really didn't make sense to us. I mean, we had our shelter for domestic violence victims. We also we're developing a pretty heavy sexual assault program because we had a SANE on staff, a sexual assault nurse examiner. And so, we were able to kind of look at cases from all the different disciplines, and we were just seeing some cases that weren't adding up really under any of the typical categories that we worked in every day. And so I'm a big believer in training. We spend a lot of time with our national partners and we just believe in being the first one there if there's something new or some new, protocol or something that we need to follow. So we got heavily involved with Shared Hope International, who, Shared Hope is an international human trafficking advocacy organization. They're heavy on policy, and so that was my groove, right?
Right.
And so we got heavily involved with them, learned a lot working with them, and then we just came back home and tried to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Because then we knew what we were looking at. We were able to put a label on the crime and the victims, and so we just kind of started chipping away in the legislature with passing our human trafficking laws, and we did that, and then we do work so closely with law enforcement. It's just the collaboration between law enforcement and victim services is just indispensable if you're gonna address crime. Some people just really want to look heavily on the criminal justice piece, but there's two sides to every crime. There's the criminal that committed the crime, and then there's the victim that's left behind.
Right.
And if we don't do our job on both ends, then we haven't had a successful encounter. So that's, to me, the magic. It's where the magic happens. Is these human trafficking ops that we're able to work with our law enforcement partners, where we're there when victims are recovered, because we've just learned so much, and we learn more every day in working with these victims. And if it's just like everything else, if you'll ask the right questions and then listen to the answers and then be willing to change some things yourself, you can really advance pretty quickly. And so that's been overall what we've tried to do.
Well, I think that, going back to the beginnings of this, when you used to think of human trafficking, you used to think overseas.
Right? Yeah.
And it's still a current that we're fighting against. And I'm glad that, again, that you agreed to show up for the podcast here, because it's not. It is a local issue. And especially when you talk about things that addiction, for example, and how it's driving. We see the tragedy. It's not necessarily here in Starkville necessarily, but throughout Mississippi, we've seen where you have addiction. You've got a really high risk there of, especially with children and innocents. And we've came across cases with parenting issues involving children and being, sold out.
Right.
And it is a hard issue. It's a tough issue. And it's one that is impacting every state. And I think Felicia, she's got a background in New Mexico, and you commented earlier about what you personally saw and why this was so close to you, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that it really clicked for me. I honestly left New Mexico. I was going to school there at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And I left there because of the safety. It was just not a factor. It didn't seem as though we were being taken care of in the sense of our safety.
Right.
There was one specific girl that I had a class with, and she had been taken just crossing the street from her sorority. And that was one of the things where I was like, okay, it's getting a lot closer to me and everything.
Right.
And there was also a situation where I had been pulled over by a man who was pretending to be a police officer. And that, to my understanding, has become, since I've left, it's become an bigger problem.
Right.
And they'll go to, and when I reported this to the real police officers, it was one of those things where they told me, they were like, well, on that street, which is Wyoming Boulevard, it's like a notorious street that girls will go missing from. He said that the week before this had happened to me and my friend, 7 girls had gone missing just off of that street. And that was a scary incident. And he explained to me that sometimes they'll find these flashing lights. They can tint them blue very easily and then put them on their own cars. And who's to know if that's a real police officer or not if you don't know the signs and everything. And it was one of those situations where I really look back on it and I think like that could have ended so many different ways.
Right.
And that was another reason for me leaving. And I came out to Mississippi. And
a little culture shock.
Well, I'm a military brat, so I'm a little used to it. But yeah, definitely, it was definitely a little bit of culture shock coming straight from there, and then feeling so much safer. as well as being a little bit closer to where I guess home would be. And it's just, it was one of those things where I really felt like, okay, this is a really serious thing that I even myself thought, okay, this is not as big of a deal until I really saw it for myself. And I was, okay, this is not something that should be, swept under the rug and things like that. And I feel like it's just never spoken about enough.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up Sound of Freedom, because that movie obviously has been a huge hit.
Right.
And I think that we're so grateful that the issue has been brought to the forefront.
Yeah.
But there is a complication that comes with that movie, in that is, set in a third world country, and it is a kidnapping and that sort of thing. And here, that's not usually what we see.
Right.
And so, it's really important to make sure that the community understands what it usually is and what it's usually not. And that's not to say that somebody's not going to get kidnapped in the Walmart parking lot in a white van, but that's not generally what we see with human trafficking. So, it really, the cool thing about the movie was it gave us a really good opportunity to talk about the myths and reality. And, it's an interesting thing. I don't know why people grasp the spectacular, the stories, the urban legends. I don't know why people tend to grasp onto those more than just listening when, we talk about safety with your kids and their cell phones.
Right.
It's just a lot more fantastical to talk about getting snatched in the Walmart parking lot than it is to just be safe on your cell phone.
Yeah. Well, to take it back on the reality, 2,500. It's a number that I use often, and I listened to Sheriff Gladney actually did a presentation in one of his interviews with the local addict that was addicted to methamphetamine, and he said that his average habit, $2,500 a month. Mm-hmm. And when you use a number, it's amazing how people go to their checking account, then they also go, wow. Then they start thinking, okay, how are you feeding that habit, right? And most of the time it's through theft, but then quickly you have bodies, or you have, unfortunately, children. And that's where it gets complicated. It's not sensational. It's not the boogeyman in the woods, right?
Right.
It is very real. It's very complicated when you start talking about addiction and its relationship, again, to human trafficking. And we see, I think, in Mississippi, I think that's unfortunate that that's one of the underlying causes there. Is that?
Yeah, and I think if they're not addicted when they go into the life, they certainly have about a 90% chance to be addicted when they get through, or when they get recovered. So it is, and in teaching, working with law enforcement, one of the main things we talk about is that you can understand why a victim who is raped repeatedly or forced to have sex, or have these things done to them. I always tell law enforcement, well, the last wedding you went to, the last party you went to, how many drinks did you have before you got on the dance floor?
Right.
And for most people, they have to be honest and say, well, I had a couple of drinks. Okay, well, why? Because it made you more comfortable. So imagine being raped multiple times a night and sold and, abused and everything else. And it's a coping mechanism that is necessary for survival. And so, most of the times when victims are recovered, that is the first go-to. Okay, this person is either high on fentanyl. We're seeing a lot of fentanyl. I know you guys are probably too.
That's right.
And, these are dangerous. These drugs can kill you graveyard dead.
Never seen anything like it. Yep.
And but so the whole detox thing and the recovery from alcohol and addiction, that's usually step number one when it comes to what they need.
Yeah, well, and government entities aren't built to provide the services that you guys are providing, right? And it's not, the predator apprehension, I would think, is probably the easiest part of the process. It is the victory is declared in the success of the victim's life afterwards. That's where, again, it gets complicated. That's where you have to have people like yourself and like your amazing team that cares. And it's not cheap. It is to be able to put someone through some type of rehab, children involved, overnight stays, protection.
Right.
Tell us about some of your challenges within your organization on addressing that. What do you do how do you fund yourself, and how can we help?
Well, we have there's two prongs to our program. One is our Tower facility, which is a long-term recovery in-house program where the survivors can come and stay up to 2 years and just take their time recovering. We offer a multitude of therapeutic modalities. We do animal assisted therapies. We
Sample horses.
Yeah, we do. Use the horses and the donkeys, and we've got dogs there and cats in the shelter, and so we do that, and we case management. Detox treatment is a part of that. We work with a lot of our partners to be able to get that done. And then the other side of it is our rapid response program, where we have rapid response advocates in each of the state's highway patrol districts. And you guys actually have one here.
That's right.
in the Starkville area that is, and the reason it's so important for them to be there close is because when a victim is recovered, if they can't be met with emergent services, then they're most likely going to disappear.
Yeah.
Because, and again, talking about the partnership between victim services and law enforcement, it really helps for you guys to be able to just do what you do. Right. And concentrate on building the case, and we'll take the victim, and it's it's a great dance to see the respect that one side has for the other, and just building that camaraderie. And it's funny because we're so close to so many law enforcement, and they understand that once a victim comes in and is a client of ours, that we're bound by confidentiality. And, the natural thing is for them to say, hey, is she still there? And it's kind of funny because they're like, we can't answer that question. Right. And by the same token, our girls don't say to the investigators, why didn't you charge him with so-and-so? So there's just a healthy respect on both sides for the job that both sides do, both partners do. But so those are the two approaches that we have to working with human trafficking. The biggest problem I think we still have in our state is, the approach for our minors. And our program is for adults. We do assist with minors who are recovered all over the state. And, there are dozens and dozens of tips on minors that continue to come through all the time. And so that's the struggle is trying to change the system and the systemic approach where so many times the victim is blamed. If it's a minor, oh, she's a runaway, she's a bad kid, she's a troublemaker.
She's a child.
She's all...
or he is a child.
Right. She's all of these things. And that was one of the things that we were able to do under Speaker Gunn's leadership is in House Bill 1559, we were able to say, if it's commercial sex and it's a minor, she is a victim.
Right.
Period. So, that was a huge accomplishment, and that really has changed the paradigm for the whole approach. But, to answer your question, we are funded primarily through federal grants. We're hoping for a little more state support because the need is greater, and we just running with our tongues hanging out. I mean, it's just super, super busy. And, we need more people. We need more help, obviously, more tools to be able to help these clients.
Yeah, I think as the awareness increases and as more and more law enforcement become trained, more nurses become trained, you start to see, okay, not only is there awareness, there's more effective action, there's more cases being brought up, and therefore there's more support that's needed. And again, government's not really built for this.
No.
And it should be in a perfect world, but they're not. And I know that any law enforcement entity, when they look at, a victim of children and things like that, all the support services that are needed, it's like, oh, wow. And Mississippi and the support services that are built in, they're doing their best, but funding is everything. And I can't think of more important issues than things like human trafficking. And it hits very home, and the economic impact it has upon a society is huge, and it's truly a representation of priorities. And we put a lot of priorities out there that are not related necessarily to, victim recovery.
I was just going to say, too, because you mentioned that this is a local thing, not just a regional or an overseas thing. I read this morning, I was looking up more research and everything about it, and I read this morning that Mississippi has the highest incidence rate in all of the U.S. And I thought about that for a second. I was like, wow, like that's probably just for what is reported as well.
But see, I think you have to look at that a different way, because here, we're taking a very proactive approach, and with our task forces and everything that's happening across the state. And what we're seeing is more cases. We're recovering more victims. We're starting to see some of these cases that are coming up. It takes a long time to investigate a human trafficking case. It takes a lot of expertise and a lot of time, but we're starting to see some of these cases. In the beginning, they were mostly federal. And, recently through the AG's office, we had our first successful state prosecution of a human trafficking case.
Right.
And he got, 25 years, I think. So, and most of them plead out because law enforcement does such a good job investigating the case that they just plead out at the end. So, but there's definitely a lot of work that's got to be done. But I think it's like we used to tell law enforcement years ago when we would talk about domestic violence. If a domestic violence victim doesn't believe that law enforcement will help them, they will not call.
That's right.
If a victim, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, whatever it is, if a victim has the confidence in their law enforcement department that they care and they will do something to address the issue, they will call you. So what does that translate into?
Yeah.
Stats. That translates into stats, and it translates into cases. And so I think those stats that you see are evidence of the good work that's being done.
And definitely a lot of good work is being done. It's also one of those things, too, though, that it kind of makes me sad that I feel like there probably is a lot of people who don't feel like they can report things.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's kind of what it made me think of, like, wow, like this is just what we're hearing about. And it's definitely one of those things where it's hopefully going to come down and everything. And I think that there has been great work put in. And like I said, I found it honestly kind of unbelievable that Mississippi was a higher incidence rate than a place like New Mexico, where I had seen these things with my own eyes. And here I come out here and I don't really see that as often. And I know that it happens, but it's one of those things where I saw it everywhere when I was in New Mexico.
Right.
And maybe I was just more keen on seeing it, but
proactive reporting, proactive positioning is probably the results of that.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, Sandy, you talked about something that I'm curious about: trust. Trust is it's hard to get. It's easy to lose.
Yeah.
And when you come in contact with these victims, all of their relationships or manipulation. How do you establish trust? I know you got a phenomenal team. I looked at some of the individuals on there. You've got an outstanding team, right?
We really do.
And how do you establish trust with how big of a challenge is that?
A huge challenge because, if most of the adult victims that we work with were trafficked as a child, and they went through the system where they were labeled as a troubled child, they were a runaway, they were this, they were that. Well, most of them had either lived in a violent home or were sexually assaulted or something, and we missed it. We missed it, and we're missing way too many of those cases with our children. But, I think that, and you got a short one, you got a very small window to establish that trust. And I think especially with somebody who's, lived a lot more of these experiences, because they've heard a lot of times over a 10 or 15 year period, we want to help you. We want to help you. Okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you're going to take me to juvie and lock me up? What does that mean? And so they just become very jaded. They don't trust anybody. And the truth of the matter is that, these traffickers prey on vulnerability, and then they sell the dream, and then they meet the needs. And so with so many of these victims, their trafficker is the person who takes care of them. And that's a sick, for us, we don't understand that. But for many of these children, the trafficker at least, gives them some sense of family, or, they will occasionally feed them anyway. And if they weren't there, they'd be on the street. And so, it's a really sad situation to think about somebody being safer in the control of a trafficker than they thought they were, on the street.
We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we do. We do.
How, if an individual is listening to this podcast and they want to become a part of the solution, they want to be able to help, maybe they want to be able to sponsor an event, how do they do that?
Well, we've got a wonderful social media presence, and, we were talking about that before. I don't know much about it, but I've got some great people that do. But and that would be great. We do always need support. It costs a lot of money to do what we're doing, and especially across the whole state. So we're everywhere. Center for Violence Prevention, mscvp.org is our website. Our hashtag is hashtag MSC, the number 4 VP. You can find us on Facebook and everything. And, you can actually donate right on our website, or you can reach out to any of the staff. And we actually are starting to interact a lot with victims and survivors through our social media platforms. I really never thought it would be as busy as it is. I mean, we have a lot of Facebook messages coming in, I need help. And maybe all they've got is Wi-Fi. That's the only way they have to communicate. So it's becoming more and more important. So, yeah, we would love any support. Absolutely.
Well, and, if you're a fraternity or a sorority out there and you're looking for a good cause, consider listening to the podcast and be able to put in some support on this, because this is something that's going to have a dramatic impact throughout the state. Yeah. So, in closing, what do you want our viewers to know about your organization, or your final thoughts?
I guess that there's always help and there's always hope. I mean, we've seen some really difficult, tough cases, and, people say, well, how do you do this work? And I think you just celebrate the wins. I mean, you're thankful for being able to have the tools that we have to be able to give that survivor a hope of recovery, and to see them launch is just the sweetest thing ever.
That's awesome. Yeah, no doubt. Our own ID team, and they're sitting beyond the camera you're watching, they got to experience a little bit of that joy. We had a young lady with special needs that left her home out west. I won't get into a specific state. She became trafficked within the trucking industry, and they came across her through our use of technology. They were responsible for apprehension and recovery of her, because she came through the region of Starkville region, I will say. They located her in Ohio, and they got to experience what your staff does. They got her back, got the support going, and that was a good day, and that was a victory day that you just, it's not going to be, because it's a pending investigation and all that, we don't, broadcast everything, especially if it's not a arrest made necessarily here within our region. But we knew that day it mattered. And it mattered for the families, it mattered for the mom, it mattered for everybody involved, and it was very special. So we get it, we understand it, and I'm very glad that you guys choose to do that on a daily basis.
Well, you've got a great team yourself. It's a great, everybody that we've encountered here at the PD they're just outstanding people, and thank you for your leadership and setting that standard.
Well, I am a lucky man, no doubt on that. Felicia, you got anything to add in a closing?
Thank you for being a voice for all of this and setting
an invitation. Thank you.
Of course. We hope to see you again next time, too. So Thank you for watching The Guardian, and we hope to see you all next time, too.
Thank you. Appreciate you.